It is the summer of 1945, and the Pacific War is drawing to a close. On a small island, far from the bustling centers of Tokyo or New York, a group of Japanese female prisoners stand behind the wire of an American POW camp. The sun beats down on the barren earth, the air thick with the sting of salt water and the ghosts of conflict. Their uniforms, once pristine, are now tattered, their faces drawn with exhaustion. The weight of surrender presses down on them, the very concept of being captured a stain on their honor. Yet this moment is unlike any they could have ever imagined. The victorious Americans, whose soldiers they were taught to fear, do not treat them as the vanquished. They do not shout or beat. They do not enforce the brutal dehumanization so common in their own camps. Instead, there is something unsettling about the way the American soldiers behave. They are kind, polite, unfamiliar. One woman, a former nurse, looks up, her eyes meeting the gaze of an American officer. She is confused, unsure whether she should speak, let alone look him in the eye. But he offers her a drink of water, something so simple, yet so deeply alien to her. She takes it in trembling hands, her mind spinning with questions. Is this an act of mercy? Or is it an insult, a final affront to the pride she once held so dear? For these women, surrender has not just shattered their bodies, it has shattered their understanding of the world. And in this moment, as they stand in the harsh light of a new reality, they cannot yet comprehend the profound shift that has just begun. One that will echo far beyond the war, into the heart of humanity itself. The brutality of the Pacific War. The Pacific War, a brutal and unrelenting conflict, was defined by a savage clash of ideologies, marked by unyielding violence and an enduring belief in absolute victory. For the Japanese, the war was not simply a battle for territory, but a fight to uphold the sacred honor of the emperor. A conflict framed in terms of ultimate sacrifice. In this environment, the Japanese soldier, especially the officers and soldiers assigned to the Imperial Army, was trained to face death rather than surrender. Their code of conduct, rooted in Bushido, the way of the warrior, emphasized honor above all. And for many, surrender was seen as the ultimate disgrace. This sense of honor was instilled early in the lives of both men and women. Japanese women, often relegated to roles as nurses, comfort women, or clerks, were taught to uphold their nation's values. Though not on the front lines, they contributed to the war effort in vital, yet frequently invisible ways. For women who were caught by the Allies, whether as nurses or civilian auxiliaries, the idea of capture was as shameful as it was terrifying. They had been taught that to fall into enemy hands was to lose one's honor, perhaps even one's life. The scale of the conflict, especially in the Pacific Islands, meant that the nature of battle itself was horrific. The brutal invasions of territories like Saipan, Guam, and Okinawa left few civilians untouched. Those who survived the bombings, the atrocities, and the relentless fighting found themselves in a world shaped by blood and ruin. As the war turned against Japan, these women, like their male counterparts, found themselves caught between two realities: the expectation of their nation's military ethos and the reality of their capture by a power that was not supposed to show mercy. Section 2. The First Encounters and Cultural Divide. In 1944, as American forces began their island-hopping campaign, capturing strategic points across the Pacific, the stories of Japanese female POWs first began to emerge. The battle for Saipan in June of that year was one of the most devastating for both the Japanese forces and the civilian population. It was here that the first large-scale captures of Japanese women soldiers and civilians took place. The women found themselves in a strange and new world. behind enemy lines, under the watch of soldiers they had been told to fear. At first, the treatment of these women was largely dictated by necessity. The Americans, who had just witnessed the horrors of war and the dehumanization of their own soldiers by the Japanese, were quick to realize the importance of handling POWs with a level of respect and dignity that had been too often absent in the treatment of Allied captives in the Pacific. Yet this was not an instinctive decision. Rather, it was shaped by the American military's philosophy on humanitarianism and propaganda. The U.S. Army's official stance was one of respect for human life, a stance rooted in the tradition of the Geneva Conventions, which promoted the humane treatment of prisoners of war. While the U.S. government had publicly denounced Japan's brutal treatment of prisoners, the American soldiers on the ground were not immune to their own biases. The cultural gulf between the Americans and their captives was immense. To the Japanese, the Americans were seen as soft, weak, and undisciplined, certainly not a force to be respected. Yet, it was this very softness, the fact that the Americans did not seek vengeance, that began to plant seeds of doubt among the female captives. In the eyes of these women, the Americans should have treated them with disdain. They had expected nothing less. But the reality was far different. Instead of the humiliation and fear they anticipated, there were acts of simple decency. Prisoners were offered food, water, and sometimes even medical care. Though this treatment varied from camp to camp and depended on the individual officers, there was a stark contrast between the harshness of the Japanese military's methods and the seeming kindness of their captors. The mere fact that they were not forced into hard labor, made to suffer the harsh conditions of their own military camps, or publicly humiliated, left the women bewildered. The shift in power and the human cost. By 1945, the war was nearing its end. The Japanese imperial forces, battered and disorganized, were no longer able to maintain control over the vast Pacific territories they had once dominated. The fall of Okinawa in June marked a pivotal moment in the Pacific theater. It was here that the Japanese army suffered catastrophic losses, and civilians, including women, found themselves trapped in the crossfire. The airstrikes, the relentless naval bombardments, and the ground battles destroyed much of Okinawa's infrastructure, leaving countless civilians to either surrender or perish. The U.S. Army's strategy, from the early days of the Pacific Campaign, had emphasized capturing islands with minimal loss of life. This shift in focus also extended to prisoners, particularly women, whose treatment starkly contrasted with that of their male counterparts. Allied troops were aware of the propaganda value of humane treatment. The stories of atrocities committed by the Japanese military, especially against POWs and civilians, were well documented and publicized, often fueling the anger and animosity felt by the Allied forces. But there was a countercurrent. American officers understood that these women were often victims, not perpetrators. They were caught in a machinery of war they had no control over, and their treatment would reflect the values of the victors. In late 1945, as Japan's surrender became imminent, following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, female prisoners began to be transported to prisoner-of-war camps across the Pacific. It was in these camps that the culture shock truly set in. The women, many of them stunned and traumatized, faced the complex emotions of both humiliation and relief. For those who had been working in support roles for the Japanese military, the idea of capture was not just physically dangerous, it also carried profound emotional consequences. The cultural teachings of Bushido had long told them that defeat was a fate worse than death. But the Americans had, seemingly, turned this narrative on its head. The first reports from female Japanese POWs began to surface in late 1945, revealing the profound internal conflict they experienced. Many could not understand why their captors were not more vengeful. Some even questioned whether this treatment was part of a greater psychological strategy. The idea that their captors, whom they had been taught to fear and despise, could show such compassion was an emotional and cognitive dissonance that few could process easily. These women, taught to embrace suffering for their country, were now forced to reconcile that suffering with the kindness they received at the hands of the enemy. Meanwhile, the soldiers who encountered them were similarly affected. Many had been exposed to the brutal side of war, fighting in horrific conditions, enduring immense hardship, and watching their comrades fall in battle. The recognition of shared humanity between captor and captive began to emerge as a subtle yet powerful force in the post-war environment. It was not simply about showing mercy. It was about recognizing the innocence and suffering of those who had been caught in the tide of war, women who had played no part in the decisions that led to the Pacific's devastation. As the war wound down, these women, some former soldiers, others civilians caught in the military machine, found themselves being processed, questioned, and ultimately repatriated. The face of victory was now being redefined not by the flag that flew over the ruins, but by the quiet acts of compassion and restraint that marked the relationship between former enemies. The clash of cultures, between the ruthless pragmatism of the Japanese military and the more ideals-driven values of the United States, had reached a critical point. For many of the Japanese women, the war had ended not just on the battlefield, but in the unexpected humanity they received from those they had been taught to hate. The human angle, captivity, and compassion. For the women who were captured by American forces, the experience of imprisonment was unlike anything they could have anticipated. The shock of surrender was compounded by the overwhelming disbelief at the humane treatment they received. Many of these women had been taught their entire lives that the enemy was to be despised and feared, that there was no mercy in the hearts of their captors, to be treated with dignity, to be offered food and water without punishment or humiliation was a concept that was hard to grasp. The emotional toll on these women was immense. Some had witnessed the brutal deaths of loved ones. Others had been exposed to the full horrors of the war. The trauma of survival was compounded by the cognitive dissonance they experienced. How could the enemy be so kind? This question haunted many of them long after the war had ended. Some expressed gratitude, while others, burdened by their own nation's military culture, saw it as a form of manipulation. Yet, despite the uncertainty, a profound realization began to set in. For the first time, they were being treated as equals. The tactical angle, strategic decision-making and propaganda. The decision to treat female prisoners of war humanely was not purely born of altruism. It was a tactical choice. The Americans understood the value of psychological warfare, and their treatment of prisoners was designed to send a message not just to the women in their camps, but to the entire Japanese population. After the shocking devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the U.S. leadership sought to solidify their victory in a way that would reshape Japan's understanding of the world. They could not simply defeat the Japanese military. They needed to redefine their identity and facilitate the rebuilding of a nation torn apart by its own internal contradictions. The propaganda of the Japanese military had long painted the Allied forces as brutal and merciless, and many women who found themselves captured were shocked to see the reality of their situation. To treat their captors as human beings, to engage in dialogue and be treated with respect, served to undermine Japan's wartime narrative. It was a psychological battle fought not on the battlefield, but in the minds of both captives and their captors. For the Americans, it was important to reinforce their ideals of liberty and humanity. which contrasted sharply with the dehumanizing practices they had witnessed from the Japanese forces. The cultural angle: Bushido versus Western humanitarianism. The most striking cultural contrast that emerged in these interactions was the clash between Bushido, the samurai code of honor that emphasized loyalty, self-sacrifice, and an unrelenting commitment to death over surrender, and the Western ideals of mercy and humanitarianism. For many Japanese women, their sense of duty had been intertwined with their nation's militaristic values. To surrender was a dishonorable act, and in the face of death, it was often preferable to choose death over capture. Yet, the Americans, rooted in values that prized life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, could not bring themselves to follow the same path of brutality that the Japanese had employed. The Japanese military culture also promoted a stark view of the enemy, one that dehumanized them to a degree that made any form of mercy difficult to comprehend. Japanese civilians and soldiers alike were raised to view the Allies as subhuman, as barbarians, not worthy of basic human decency. The women taken captive had never expected to be treated as human beings by their enemy. Yet, for the Americans, this was not just about mercy. It was about winning the moral war. In showing restraint, they weren't just defeating an army. They were demonstrating the superiority of their way of life, one founded on the respect of human rights and the dignity of the individual. The propaganda angle: using mercy as a weapon. The United States, much like their adversaries, understood the power of narrative. By treating their female prisoners with dignity, the U.S. military was not only creating a stark contrast to the atrocities committed by the Japanese, but was also crafting a powerful message of its own. After all, the Allies were not just fighting a physical war, but a psychological one. For the Japanese people, whose sense of nationalism was wrapped in pride and honor, the idea that the Americans could show such mercy was an attack on the very foundation of their militaristic identity. The Americans did not need to treat their prisoners in such a humane manner, yet the strategic importance of winning the peace, not just the war, was paramount. This wasn't only a tactic to break the Japanese spirit. It was also aimed at the larger war of ideas. Propaganda posters had long depicted the enemy as inhuman, but the reality of how the U.S. treated its prisoners, especially women, sent a clear message: we are better than you. It was a method of conquest, not just of territory, but of morality itself. The treatment of female POWs became a narrative weapon that would resonate far beyond the war's end. The gender angle: women in the war machine. The roles of women in wartime Japan were both complex and essential. Unlike the women in the Western world, who were often relegated to the home front or medical duties, Japanese women were deeply involved in the war effort. They worked in factories, served as nurses, and in many cases, were pressed into the military as auxiliary soldiers, contributing to the strength of the Imperial Army. Women such as these were not passive victims, but active participants in the war. However, they were also among the most vulnerable of the captured populations. Many women in the Imperial Army were assigned to auxiliary roles, serving as nurses, clerks, or even comfort women for the troops. Some had little choice but to serve, while others volunteered, driven by a sense of duty or nationalism. For the women who found themselves captured, the horror was twofold. First, they were prisoners of a war they did not choose. Second, they faced the gender-based assumptions and biases of their captors. American soldiers, many of whom had never encountered women in the military before, had to adjust to the fact that these were not helpless civilians, but rather empowered women who had participated in a ruthless war. Yet, In the eyes of their captors, they were still to be treated as individuals deserving of respect. This nuanced understanding of gender roles was an important element of the interactions between captor and captive, and one that profoundly affected the women's perception of their captors. The unspoken role of women in Imperial Japan's wartime ideology. The women who were captured in the Pacific were not just pawns in a military strategy. They were also products of a deeply ingrained ideological system. The Japanese wartime culture had rigid expectations for women. They were supposed to embody the virtues of selflessness, loyalty, and sacrifice. To surrender, especially for a woman, was seen as an even greater dishonor than for a man. These women had been raised to believe that their bodies and their lives belonged to the emperor, and in times of war, their duty was absolute. However, the reality of war revealed the cracks in these ideals. Many of the female prisoners, despite their initial shock at their treatment, found themselves reflecting on their roles. They began to understand that their efforts, while valuable, had often been part of a system that sought to exploit them for a greater cause, a cause that ultimately led to their defeat. The American treatment of female POWs, though respectful, nonetheless forced them to confront the gap between their indoctrination and their true experience. It was an experience that left many questioning their roles in the war, and for the first time, their place in a world no longer defined by the emperor. The surrender of Japan and the first encounter. The fall of Japan was swift and catastrophic. In August 1945, the world watched as the U.S. dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, obliterating entire cities and inciting a rapid collapse of Japan's ability to continue the war. In the aftermath, Emperor Hirohito addressed the nation on the radio for the first time, announcing Japan's unconditional surrender. His words marked the end of an era, not just for the Japanese military, but for an entire culture steeped in the belief that the emperor was divine, and that death in battle was the ultimate honor. As Japan bowed to the might of the Allied forces, the women who had been captured in the Pacific Islands were forced to confront a reality they had never imagined. Surrender, once an unthinkable choice, was now the only path left for survival. American soldiers, who had fought tirelessly against the imperial forces, were now tasked with managing the delicate process of repatriation and rehabilitation. The sheer scale of the capture was overwhelming. Hundreds of women, some soldiers and others civilians, were taken to POW camps scattered across the Pacific. In these camps, the turning point of their journey began. What had started as surrender, a shameful act according to their military code, now became something entirely different. It was no longer just a loss of honor, but the beginning of an unanticipated shift in identity. The first encounters between female Japanese prisoners and their American captors were awkward, charged with uncertainty. These women had been trained to hate and fear the enemy, to believe in their inferiority. Yet, as the weeks passed, they began to witness something unexpected. The Americans were treating them differently. Instead of harsh interrogations and demeaning punishment, the women were fed, given fresh clothes, and provided medical care. One woman, a former nurse, recalled her astonishment at being offered a bowl of rice and a cup of tea by a young American soldier. "It was like being given a gift," she said years later, still in disbelief. "We had been taught to expect cruelty, but this was kindness, and I didn't know how to respond." The cognitive dissonance was profound. These women had been taught their entire lives that surrendering to the enemy was disgraceful. But in this moment of defeat, compassion from the enemy began to undermine everything they had known. The soldiers, for their part, were equally affected. They had seen the brutality of war firsthand, and now, as they helped these women, their actions became a way of demonstrating their moral superiority. Yet, it was not just about charity. It was about human dignity, about restoring a sense of self-worth to those who had been dehumanized by their own society. Section 2. The shift in perception and the cultural revelation. As the weeks turned into months and the full scope of the aftermath settled in, the captured women began to ask themselves difficult questions. Why were they being treated with kindness? Was this an act of mercy, or was it some form of manipulation? They had been raised to see the Americans as uncivilized, as the epitome of everything their nation was meant to destroy. But now, standing on the opposite side of this vast cultural divide, the image they had once had of their enemies began to crumble. For many of the female POWs, the psychological and emotional toll of their captivity was intense. Some had lost family members, others had witnessed the collapse of their homeland. But the thing that shook them the most was not the physical toll of war. It was the moral disorientation. The Japanese military had taught them that to surrender was to lose everything. They had been conditioned to accept death, to embrace it as a sign of loyalty and strength. Yet now, they found themselves experiencing the unexpected. Compassion, relief, and in some cases, an overwhelming sense of shame. This turning point was not just about survival. For many of these women, it was about reconciling their sense of duty with the humanity they were encountering in their captors. What did it mean to be treated with respect when everything they had been taught told them they were unworthy of such kindness? It was in this space of profound contradiction that the women found themselves questioning the values they had so deeply embraced. As American officers and soldiers began to treat the prisoners with humanity, the women began to see their captors not as monsters, but as men. Men who were bound by different values, yes, but still human. It was a quiet act of reconciliation, one that would not be fully understood in the chaos of the moment, but one that would resonate in the years that followed, breaking myths and building trust. As the months passed and Japan's official surrender took full effect, the contrast between American and Japanese treatment of prisoners remained stark. The images of American soldiers gently interacting with the former Japanese POWs continued to be ingrained in the minds of those who had witnessed it. But for the women who were in those camps, the shift in perception wasn't merely the result of kindness. It was a cultural revelation that began to transform their understanding of the war, their nation, and themselves. The turning point had been subtle but significant. It wasn't just that they were being treated with food and water. It was that the Americans treated them with an unspoken respect that began to dissolve the myths they had carried throughout the war. These myths, deeply embedded in Japanese wartime ideology, painted the Americans as less than human, as the ultimate enemy who deserved only contempt. To surrender to such a foe, to be captured by them, was seen as a loss of self, a disgraceful fate. Yet the treatment the women received suggested otherwise. It planted a seed of doubt in their minds. Doubt about the narrative they had been fed, about the brutal enemy they had been taught to despise. One of the most profound shifts occurred when a group of American nurses took it upon themselves to care for the Japanese women, offering basic medical attention and hygiene practices they had never before experienced. The women, many of whom were physically exhausted or injured, had never imagined such care from the enemy. For them, it was as if their very humanity was being restored, piece by piece. They had been raised to view war as a means of total domination, but the Americans showed them that it could also be a means of healing. It was a fundamental breach of the ideals they had once believed in. For the Japanese women, receiving medical attention from the Americans was not just a physical relief. It was a psychological reconciliation with the enemy. They began to understand that the war had not been simply about battlefield supremacy, but about an ideological struggle. The U.S. soldiers, as they bandaged wounds and treated injuries, became symbols of the moral war the Allies had waged. A war not just for victory, but for the preservation of human dignity. The realization that the Americans did not seek to humiliate or destroy them left a lasting impact. The myth of the American barbarian, deeply ingrained through wartime propaganda, was gradually dismantled. Many of these women came to see their captors as individuals, not as a faceless enemy. They recognized that their personal experiences with the Americans, the men who had given them food, shelter, and medicine, were vastly different from the war crimes they had been taught to expect. This awakening was profound. What they had been told about their enemy had been false. But this process wasn't without its struggles. There were moments of tension, confusion, and resentment. Some of the women found it hard to let go of the years of indoctrination that had told them the Americans were a threat to their very existence. Yet, as they spent more time in the camps, as they interacted with the soldiers, their views began to shift. The myth of the unmerciful enemy was replaced by the reality of men and women, just like themselves, caught up in a conflict they could not control. The realization that both sides had suffered equally, though in different ways, was a turning point in their emotional journey. The American soldiers, too, were deeply affected by the experience. While their mission had been to win the war, they had not been prepared for the emotional and moral complexities of dealing with the aftermath. Many had entered the war with a desire for justice, but the human connection they experienced with these female prisoners made them reconsider the very nature of victory. Some soldiers, especially those involved in the medical and humanitarian aid efforts, found themselves questioning the brutality of the war they had fought and the unrelenting cycle of violence they had participated in. These moments of interaction between captor and captive, soldier and prisoner, were a quiet testament to the human cost of war and to the potential for reconciliation, even in the most unimaginable circumstances. As the process of repatriation began and the women were sent back to Japan, their experiences in the American POW camps stayed with them. For many, it was the first time they had ever encountered true mercy from their former enemies. And for the American soldiers, it was a reminder of the responsibility they had to rebuild the world after the war, not just militarily, but morally. The women who had been treated as equals, with respect, dignity, and humanity, became part of a larger narrative of how the post-war world would define itself. Rebuilding lives and societies, the war's end was a time of sweeping change for all involved, but for the women who had been captured by American forces, the consequences were particularly complex. For many of them, the journey back to Japan was not only a physical return to their homeland, but a psychological and emotional reconciliation with the experience of their captivity. The humiliation of surrender, which had been so ingrained in them, had not been as absolute as they had once feared, yet it still weighed heavily on their sense of identity. As they made their way back to Japan, these women faced a country that was in ruins. The impact of the atomic bombings and the devastation of urban centers left Japan in a state of disarray. Food shortages, structural collapse, and economic dislocation were immediate realities. The country's moral fabric, too, was stretched thin as it grappled with the deep questions of national identity and the shame of defeat. Many women found that the military culture they had once subscribed to no longer seemed to fit into this post-war world. Back home, the cultural expectations of women in Japan were still steeped in the ideals of obedience and sacrifice. Many of the women who had been captured were initially met with suspicion or shame. They had been prisoners, a fate that was not supposed to befall someone who had held the ideals of Bushido so close to heart. The traditional Japanese narrative emphasized strength, endurance, and the willingness to die for the emperor, but the realities of war, for many, did not match these ideals. The women who had survived had to come to terms with their survival, with the stigma of being a prisoner of war hanging over them. Yet, despite the initial backlash, these women slowly began to integrate back into society. Their survival stories, their experiences of mercy and kindness at the hands of American soldiers, quietly found their place in Japan's rebuilding narrative. The stories of their captivity, once seen as disgraceful, gradually became part of the broader narrative of reconciliation. These women were not the failures they had once feared being labeled as. They had been treated with dignity, and they brought back with them the memory of humanity in a world that had been torn apart by inhumanity. However, the psychological toll of their experience remained. Many women struggled with guilt and survivor's remorse. They had survived the war, but the emotional scars remained deep. Some found solace in sharing their experiences, but others kept their stories hidden, too painful to revisit. Post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, was not widely understood at the time, but the mental health struggles of these women became an unspoken part of their return to civilian life. Section 2. The broader historical impact and long-term effects. The women who had been captured by American forces were not the only ones who would feel the reverberations of their experience. The United States' treatment of POWs, specifically the way they handled female Japanese prisoners, would serve as a turning point in the way the world viewed post-war reconciliation. The U.S. had not only defeated Japan militarily, but had also, in a subtle yet profound way, begun to shape a new global morality. The contrast between the American treatment of POWs and the Japanese treatment of Allied soldiers was stark, and it became part of the propaganda narrative used to rebuild Japan after the war. The humane treatment of women prisoners was a direct response to the war crimes committed by Japan. However, the American ideals of fairness and human rights, which became the foundation for the post-war world order, were also complicated by the realities of occupation. The Japanese people, under American occupation, were encouraged to adopt democratic values. But for the women who had been on the receiving end of both the brutality of the Japanese military and the compassion of the American soldiers, their story became a testament to the potential for transformation in the aftermath of war. The Geneva Conventions, which had been signed before the war, gained significant weight in the post-war era, and the treatment of POWs became a key issue in global diplomacy. American soldiers who participated in the humane treatment of Japanese prisoners were seen as a living representation of the Western values of justice and mercy. The stories of these women were sometimes overshadowed by the larger narratives of war crimes and atrocities, but over time, their humanizing experiences became an important part of the larger post-war discourse on how nations should treat their enemies after conflict. The emotional and cultural transformation for the women did not happen overnight. It was a slow process of adjustment, not just to the loss of the war, but to the emotional complexities of their survival. They were living symbols of the moral contradictions that had characterized the war itself, victims of their own country's militarism, yet recipients of mercy from the very enemies they had been taught to destroy. Over time, many came to see this experience as a crucial part of their personal healing. They began to accept that survival, while difficult, was not a moral failure. It was a step towards something new, a world where, perhaps, humanity could find a way to transcend the horrors of war. In the quiet aftermath of war, when the dust of battle had settled and the world began to rebuild, The experiences of these female Japanese prisoners became a quiet testament to the resilience of the human spirit. They had entered the war as tools of a brutal ideology, bound by the expectations of their nation and the indomitable forces of war. They had been raised to believe in the absolute power of the emperor, in the inevitability of victory, and in the sanctity of self-sacrifice. Yet they left the war with something far more precious, a new understanding of humanity. The treatment they received at the hands of their American captors, marked by mercy, compassion, and dignity, did more than break down cultural myths about their enemies. It forced them to confront the truth of war, that in every conflict there are no pure victors or vanquished, only individuals, each with their own stories of suffering and survival. The dehumanizing myths they had been raised on, those that painted their enemies as less than human, crumbled when they were faced with real human kindness. It was a moment of realization that, despite the horrors of war, compassion could exist, even in the darkest of times. For the women who survived, the true turning point came not on the battlefield, but in the moments of unexpected humanity they experienced in the American POW camps. This moment of mercy, when their captors saw them not as enemies, but as human beings deserving of dignity, would forever alter their view of the world and themselves. They were forced to redefine their identities, to reconcile the values they had been taught with the lived experience of their captivity. And in that reconciliation, they found a new kind of strength, one that was not based on the rigid codes of war, but on the quiet resilience of surviving not just the external battles, but the internal ones as well. As the world moved on, the stories of these women and of their captors faded into the larger narrative of the war. Yet their experiences remained a powerful reminder of the human cost of conflict and the potential for reconciliation even in the aftermath of the most devastating wars. In a world often defined by division and strife, their stories spoke to something deeper, the universal truth that in the end, it is our shared humanity that binds us together. The war may have ended with the signing of treaties and the return of prisoners, but the lessons learned from the experiences of these women, the ones who had once been enemies, now seen as equals, would echo far beyond the Pacific. The legacy of their stories is one of transformation, not only of nations, but of individuals who, in their darkest hours, came to see the possibility of light, even in the most unexpected places. And so, in the silence of a post-war world, their quiet dignity and resilience remained as enduring symbols of the capacity for change and the power of mercy to heal even the deepest wounds of war.